Welcome and thank you for stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. These stories were first published around April 1910. They are about Lord Lister called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant among all thieves. He is the terror of usurers and moneylenders, robs them of their possessions by his wiles, protecting beleaguered innocence and supporting the needy. Man of honor in all respects. He persuaded that many abuses, protected by law, continue to proliferate with impunity. Every effort is made to apprehend Lord Lister, called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant of thieves. Reward, £1,000 sterling. Lord Lister the Silver Apostle. By Kurt Matchell. Chapter 1. A Good Catch. In a small room of the Harbour Hotel at Boulogne-sur-Mer, one cold, rainy November evening, sat Lord Lister, aka Raffles, and his assistant, Charlie Brand. They were preparing their suitcases, as Raffles intended to steam to New York on the nightboat of the Holland-America line, the Amsterdam. "Those Americans have stolen enough," he said, to Charlie Brand. "It's time I eased their consciences, that is, their money bags." At 11 o'clock in the evening the waiter entered the room and announced that the steamer was in sight. "How long will it be before the boat arrives?" asked the great unknown. "About an hour more, then she has entered the harbour well and truly. Do you have anything to order, Mr. Green?" "No, thank you." The servant left the room. Lord Lister, alias Raffles, had entered the foreign book under the name of a certain Mr. James Green from Scotland, and also wanted to travel to America under this name. "What do you intend to do in New York?" asked Charlie Brand intently. "The future will tell," replied Lord Lister. "It is my custom never to plan ahead, but to let things matter." "Do you have any acquaintances over there?" "Oh, yes," laughed Raffles, "an excellent acquaintance. On my last visit to Windsor Club in London I happened to exchange my fur coat with that of the Duke of Rochester. The exchange was bad on the one hand, for my fur was much more precious than his, but on the other hand I was compensated again. I found in the inside pocket a letter from the American billionaire Whitney, in which the latter informs the Duke that he is willing to allow the other to go hunting in Mr. Whitney's fields. It was clear from the letter that the gentlemen did not know each other personally. Furthermore, in the pockets of the fur I found the card of membership of the Duke of the Windsor Club and several other visiting cards. So I'm going Mr. Whitney to be introduced by him as Duke of Rochester into the distinguished circles of America. But I will ask Whitney to keep my incognito and let him introduce me as Mr. Green." "An excellent idea," said Charlie Brand, "that could turn into something." "Before we leave," continued Lord Lister, "I want to have one more joke with the American papers. I will send a few postcards to the editors of various magazines and announce that I will come to America to practice my sport, which is to conquer millions." "That seems dangerous to me," said Charlie Brand. "The Americans are smart and you don't get into trouble unnecessarily." "The more dangerous the better," laughed John Raffles. It was getting boring, without a shred of humor. Then he sat down at a table, lit a cigarette, and wrote several postcards of the following contents to the editors of New York magazines. "Dear Sir Editor, by this I have the honor to inform you that it will give me great pleasure to make an attack soon on the full money bags of the millionaires in your city. Please spread this message to your readers through your newspaper. Nor will I fail to continually send you further tidings of my doings. Yours faithfully, John C. Raffles." Then he got up, prepared to travel, and left the hotel. Before going to the port, however, Raffles went to the station and dropped the postcards into the mail wagon of the express train waiting for Paris. "Why are you handing over those tickets to Paris?" asked Charlie Brand in surprise. "I thought they were for New York." "Certainly, but now they come first to Paris and are stamped there before being shipped from a French port, probably Le Havre, to New York. Then one has already lost the right track. It is precisely such trifles that require special attention, because it is precisely this that usually causes the greatest men to stumble." Moments later, the two boarded with the other passengers. On the second day of the sea voyage, when Raffles sat after dinner with Charlie Brand in a quiet corner of the smoking room, the former said, "Have you noticed the gentleman who is constantly watching us? Remember Mr. Robinson?" "Right. I mean Mr. Robinson, who is registered as a portrait painter on the passenger list and who is staying in cabin No. 3. The man is no more a portrait painter than the captain of this ship is a trained professor. He looks more like a merchant or like." Raffles was silent for a few seconds and looked thoughtfully at the smoke from his cigarette. Then he continued in a whisper, "Like someone from Scotland Yard." Startled, Charlie Brand looked at his friend. "From Scotland Yard? To a London detective?" "Yes, of course. And I want to put it to the test right away. Come on deck." The pair left the smoking room and went upstairs, where Lord Lister met Mr. Robinson joined. "Well, gentlemen," he addressed him, "my name is James Green from Scotland. I read in the passenger list that you are an artist, a portrait painter. I would find it a most pleasant passage of time if you would make a portrait study of me during the crossing. I wanted to give it as a gift to a friend who has his birthday soon, and I am not unwilling to pay a good sum." Mr. Robinson, a small person with a full black beard, seemed rather nervous by nature. He drummed his fingers on the parapet and replied, "I am sorry, Mr. Green, that I cannot fulfill your wish, for my painting tools are packed and in the hold below." "That's all right," replied Raffles. "If you tell the captain you'd like your tools, he'll get them out at once." "Of course." No, through Mr. Robinson, and he was still drumming his fingers. "I am very troubled by seasickness and would rather not work during the crossing." "Then I'm sorry I bothered you." Raffles bowed and went back to the smoking parlor with Charlie Brand. "He's no painter," whispered Lord Lister to his friend. "These are all excuses. But today I want to know who that person is. He watches us from the moment we are on board. If it's a detective, he's already very unfit for the job, because his system for watching someone is way too transparent. Now I will turn the tables and check him closely." Seated near Mr. Robinson, still leaning over the parapet, from time to time he looked at him with a keen eye. Raffles saw that the so-called painter noticed this and that it made him nervous and restless. A few minutes later, Mr. Robinson took his place and went to the other side of the ship. Raffles also rose and followed him. Seemingly coincidental, he sat down near the other again, and now he found that Mr. Robinson was even more nervous than before. Wherever the other took his steps, however, Lord Lister followed him like a shadow and did not lose sight of him for a second. Night fell. Raffles conversed with Charlie Brand in his cabin, the stormy weather now permitting no stay on deck. At 11 o'clock both apparently went to sleep. It was a second after midnight when Raffles opened his cabin door softly and crept down the hall. Carefully he looked around to see if he didn't notice any of the stewards. Unobserved, he came on deck, and then crawled forward like a snake until he came to cabin number 3, where Mr. Robinson slept, for whom this nighttime visit was intended. Lord Lister wanted to see if he could get hold of some papers showing who that Mr. Robinson really was. He opened the door of the hut with a simple looper, and entered the dark room. Then he closed the door carefully behind him, and listened for a few seconds to the quiet breathing of the sleeping man. At the same instant the ship was lifted high by a tremendous wave, so that it was hurled to one side. Mr. Robinson straightened up with a suppressed cry, and then saw that a stranger had crept into his cabin. Lord Lister saw that only presence of mind could save him, and before the surprised man could say anything, he began in a louder voice. "Well, Mr. Robinson, you seem to be sleeping very soundly." He immediately turned on the electric light and recognized John C. Raffles. The latter saw that Robinson's face was all twisted with terror. "Get dressed," said Lord Lister. "I intend to take you with me." Raffles thought in part that he wanted to take him to the games room to play another game of cards. But Mr. Robinson explained it very differently. Pale with terror, he leaned into the cushions and whispered, "So anyway." Then Lord Lister, waiting in vain for an answer, saw Mr. Robinson reach under his pillow with a trembling hand and pull out a revolver. Already about to leap like a tiger to wrest the weapon from him when, to his great surprise, he saw Mr. Robinson pointed the barrel of the revolver against himself and was about to snap. Lightning fast, Raffles knocked the gun out of his hand. And now he also understood that behind the name Robinson was hiding not a detective, but an as yet unsolved secret. Have you gone mad? Cried Raffles. A man's life is far too precious to be so reckless with it. Robinson looked at him with a stare, and in a hoarse voice he said, "What do I care for my life now that you have captured me?" A triumphant smile flashed into Lord Leicester's eyes for a moment, when he realized that Robinson had taken him for a detective and feared him as such. "Come on," he said, curious about the outcome. "I'm not a ruthless fellow, and willing to negotiate with you." He sat down on the sofa and lit a cigarette at his leisure. "Light up one too," he said to Mr. Robinson. "That will calm your nerves a bit. You look like you're catty." He offered Mr. Robinson's quiver, and it operated with trembling hands. After taking a few puffs, he said, "I suspected from the first moment, when I boarded this disastrous ship, that I would be arrested here." Raffles laughed, and replied, "To be smart to run off, my dear fellow. Don't think for a moment that you might be arrested. That deprives one of all calm." Replied Mr. Robinson, "I don't have nerves of steel." "Then you have chosen the wrong profession." "The devil lured me when I stole the cashier, and fled with it," sighed the other. "How much of the money have you already used?" 500 guilders at the most." "Now start giving me that money, and you'll save me the trouble of searching. Where is it hidden?" "Over there in the little suitcase." Raffles took the briefcase, was given a key, and opened it. It was full of banknotes. "Let's start counting," said Lister, and began to spread the packages on Mr. Robinson's bed. At the same time he read on the strips that were around the piles of banknotes that the money came from was from a savings bank, and that the capital was thus raised by petty people. "The loss of this money has made many poor people unhappy," said Raffles, "and I believe it is in the interests of the injured that they should get the money back, and that you be locked up." "My dear sir," said the other, "I am quite ready to give back all the money stolen, if only they let me keep my freedom. I would then try to start a new life in America." Raffles put the banknotes, which were worth about 100,000 guilders, back into the trunk, and said, "I'll tell you something. Here you still have 1,000 guilders, the rest I will have in your presence sent back by the captain of the ship to the bank that has been robbed." A blush of pleasure colored Mr. Robinson, and he stammered, You want to do that? And not take me into custody?" "No," said Raffles, "that's all right, I'll let you go. Now go to sleep and better your life." He took the suitcase with the money and left the hut. When he re-entered his, Charlie Brand was waiting for him there with a concerned countenance. "Now?" he asked him. Lord Lister laughed, opened the trunk and showed Charlie Brand the banknotes. Then he said to the astonished young man, "That is the contents of a briefcase belonging to the detective I dread so much, a fugitive cashier. It is remarkable with which people my profession does not bring me together." Chapter 2. A bet on 2 million. In the lavishly decorated clubhouse of the Player Club in New York's Gramercy Park, a large number of members gathered in the library after dinner to smoke a cigar or cigarette over a cup of coffee. The members of this American club were all persons of the first rank. Monarchs could not be better served than these men, who were highly placed in society by the colossal powers at their disposal, or by the rank they held in the fields of art or science. On this evening the conversations were very lively, as the papers had reported that Lord Lister, who had become so famous in England, who practiced burglary as a sport under the name John C. Raffles, had crossed over to America, and had himself published the papers communicated. Mr. George Bennett, the famous journalist, had now taken the floor, and said to the club members seated around him, "This man has unparalleled brutality. But I doubt, gentlemen, whether this outlawed English lord will make it any further, in view of the excellent organization of our American detective service, than that he will be able to continue his studies of the art of breaking in for several years in our great prison for burglars, the well-known Sing Sing." The audience did not seem to share this view. They argued back and forth, and just as bets were being made in true American fashion on the success or failure of John C. Raffles, Mr. Whitney, the famous American runner and billionaire, entered the library, accompanied by a stranger. The gentlemen were greeted with great cheers. Mr. Whitney presented his companion, who appeared very distinguished, as his friend, Mr. Green of Scotland, who, being a passionate hunter, intended to go hunting black bears with Teddy Roosevelt. The club members amicably shook hands with Mr. Green, and none of them were so uneducated as to ask who this Mr. Green was, where he lived, and if he had any wealth. After all, the introduction by the well-known billionaire made all further questions superfluous. Very soon Mr. Bennet turned to Mr. Whitney and asked him, "Have you read in the afternoon editions the startling report of the expected visit of the English gentleman thief, John C. Raffles?" "Oh yes," replied the inquirer, "I read the report, and I must confess that it will be a great pleasure for me to make the acquaintance of this brilliant burglar. I like such things." Mr. Villard, the editor of the Evening Post, replied, making some bets on the success or failure of this Raffles. "I argued that our American detectives would be no smarter than their colleagues in London. I believe that a person who puts his heart and soul into the art of burglary can achieve in it whatever he desires," replied Mr. Bennet. Mr. Whitney laughed. "You are mistaken," he said. "You judge our detectives far too favorably, and if you look carefully at the various cases, you will come to the conclusion that, in general, the burglars are much more successful than the detectives." After all had been silent for a few moments, Mr. Bennet went on. "I'll send my whole staff of reporters out there, and I'd be very surprised if we didn't get it, if the detectives turned out to be incapable of doing so. Before we get to work, we must know what he looks like. And furthermore," continued Villard, "that one knows where Raffles is. For my part, I am not yet convinced that they will catch him." Mr. Bennet got angry. He used to go through with whatever he set his mind to, and it could well be seen from this head on the broad bull's neck that he would leave nothing undone in order to achieve his goal. "Besides," laughed Mr. Whitney, "it would indeed be a shame if Raffles' work was ended because somehow his deeds were leaked out. I must confess that I have seldom been so excited and at the same time so amused as reading his deeds." "Beautiful philosophies of life," Bennet muttered, chewing nervously on the tip of his Havana. "And what do you think of Raffles?" asked Mr. Whitney now of Mr. Green. "You come from the English metropolis and are a member of the Windsor Club." At the name of Windsor Club, all looked with a lively gesture at Mr. Green, who had hitherto been somewhat in the background. The Windsor Club was, in English opinion, the foremost in the world, to which belonged members of the royal household and persons of the highest aristocracy. The club had only 60 members, and when it was heard that Mr. Green was a member of it, all present understood that behind this name a distinguished character was hiding. Reverent silence reigned when Mr. Green stepped closer, dropped his monocle, and said to Mr. Whitney, "We in Windsor Club think the same as you, Mr. Whitney. We are particularly interested in this man's peculiar sport, and we even once had the pleasure of seeing him suddenly in our midst one evening." Great surprise followed. "And haven't you held him?" Bennet asked. Mr. Green laughed. "That was not possible, Mr. Bennet, for we did not learn who a guest was until he had left us." "A fine fellow," exclaimed Bennet. "How many watches and wallets did he bring?" "Excuse me. Collections were made that evening for the widows and orphans of drowned sailors, and only before that appeared Mr. Raffles in our club." "Colossal," laughed Mr. Bennet. "So he ran off with the collected money? How many £1,000s was there?" The slender, muscular figure of the Englishman stretched elastically. He clutched the monocle again and looked at Mr. Bennet sharp for a few moments. Then he replied, "You are mistaken, Mr. Bennet. The various club members signed for £1,000 and John C. Raffles then handed us the same amount. He just embarrassed us." "Good Lord!" exclaims Bennet. "And how did you become aware that it was John C. Raffles?" asked Mr. Villard. Replied Mr. Green, "Every guest writes his name in a book when he leaves our club, and so if it interests you, you can find this gentleman's autograph in Windsor Club." "Well," asserted Mr. Bennet, "the English soil must have burned under his feet. Let's hope his visit doesn't cost us too much. And now let us touch on another subject. Imagine, Mr. Whitney, that I had to pay $40,000 in import duties for the Murillo I discovered in Spain. The value of the painting has been estimated at more than $1.5 million. Except me, only the Pope has such a painting by this famous painter." "If only that Murillo is real," said Mr. Whitney, "among the many forgeries that have appeared in recent times." "No, no," said Mr. Bennet. "I have had the painting judged by the best art experts in the world and they all agree that the painting I bought is a real Murillo." Apart from the Pope, I am the only one in possession of such a precious Murillo." "I beg your pardon," interrupted Mr. Green, with a mocking laugh streaking his face. "I am sorry, Mr. Bennet, to inform you that I also own a Murillo, a painting that's certainly more valuable than yours." Mr. Bennet looked at the guest for a few moments in complete astonishment. Then he laughed cheerfully and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Green, if I laugh at what you say, but it sounds so unbelievable, so utterly unbelievable, that, as sorry as I am, I doubt at least the authenticity of your painting." Mr. Green lit a cigarette, took a few puffs and said, "You are mistaken, Mr. Bennet, the authenticity of my Murillo has not even been questioned by the Pope." The audience listened in silence, and as it was a Murillo here, everyone was very interested. "That is impossible!" exclaimed Mr. Bennet again. "Yours can only be counterfeit." All watched Mr. Green full of tension. What would he do? Calmly, he now cut the ashes from his cigarette and said, "All right. I take the bet. I call all the present gentlemen to witness. We now have November 24th. Until the 24th of November of the following year I am prepared to exhibit my Murillo in this clubroom. You keep your bet, Mr. Bennet?" "Yes," he replied, "I'll bet. Of course the loser has to pay the sum immediately." "With pleasure," replied Mr. Green, and then to Mr. Whitney, "Now let's go on the hunt, dear Whitney. That's the most pleasant discount until I have to go back to Europe to get my Murillo." "I know," said Mr. Bennet, "all the English and Scottish castles, and I know that there is nowhere to be found a Murillo who has even a quarter of the value of my picture. There are only a few lesser works by Murillo in circulation. I am indeed curious as to how Mr. Green will get out of this. Only the Pope owns a more valuable painting than I do." "Let us leave the result to the future, Mr. Bennet," replied Mr. Green. "I think I can assure you, and today, that you must pay me the sum wagered." "That's impossible," exclaimed Mr. Bennet, who had lost all composure. "That's so much impossible that I'll even bet 2 million instead of 1. And Mr. Green took the raised bet. At 2 million. Chapter 3. At the detectives. Mr. Green, accompanied by Mr. Whitney, drove in his automobile to the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, where he had rented several rooms. The gentlemen bid each other farewell in the most amicable manner, and Mr. Green went in the elevator to his rooms on the second floor. There a young man waited for him, reading and smoking in front of the fireplace. When Mr. Green entered, he sprang up. After the intruder took off his fur, he went to the chamber door, examined it, and then bolted it. Then he went to the adjoining bedroom, turned on the electric light, and searched the room with the skill of a detective or a burglar. After making sure that no one had crept in, he listened to the walls, and then said to the other who sat before the fireplace, "Get out of there, Charlie. Those chimneys have the fatal property that they carry every word forward like a telephone wire. Let's go into the bedroom." Charlie Brand rose and followed the other into the adjoining room. No sooner had they entered than he asked, "Did you pass?" Replied Mr. Green in a muted tone, "The proof of membership of the Windsor Club, which I found in the Duke's fur, has already produced brilliant results. Mr. Whitney, to whom I wrote, you know, picked me up himself by car and took me to the Players' Club. He and his friends keep me, John C. Raffles, aka Mr. Green, for a real English Duke. My story about the bear hunt with Teddy Roosevelt reinforced them even more. Oh, Charlie, I assure you that these American money kings have a servile reverence for all that is aristocratic or what they consider aristocratic. In short, I was introduced to America's heaviest purses at Player Club, and I hope I'll be able to lighten those pouches a little bit. For the time being, I have already made $2 million tonight. A very decent start, don't you think, Charlie?" $2 million? Repeated Charlie Brand. "How is that possible?" "I took the opportunity. Mr. Bennet, the famous Bennet, has lost a bet to me. For he claimed to be the sole owner of a Murillo worth $1.5 million, and I claimed to have a Murillo of the same value." Raffles laughed and blew smoke rings, while Charlie Brand looked at him in amazement. "I don't understand it," he said at last. "Since when do you own a Murillo? I have never seen such a painting in your villa in Regent Park in London." "I'll believe it," replied Raffles calmly, "and if I don't have a Murillo now, I'll have one in a little while. I intend to go to Rome and borrow the Murillo, which is in the Pope's possession, for some time, and thus win my bet against Mr. Bennet." But what a plan. After all, its implementation is completely impossible. Raffles laughed. It's just child's play. It's actually beneath my dignity, and to make things a little more attractive to me now, I'll inform Inspector Baxter in London of my plan. At least then she has something to do. It is utterly impossible, repeated Charlie Brand. The Pope's Swiss guards guard the Vatican with an Argus look. How would you dispose of such a large painting? Leave that to me. And now listen very carefully to my plan of labor. Tomorrow I will have Tiffany, the famous goldsmith of New York, have a present made for the Pope, the drawing of which I will draw this night. For what purpose are you having that gift made? That's my business too. And now leave me alone for half an hour, so that I can make my draft at once. He took a sheet of paper from the folder and began to draw lines. Charlie Brand soon saw that the drawing must represent an apostle, placed on a pedestal, on which various Christian symbols were shown in relief. Wonderful, he said, shaking his head. Great, Raffles claimed, closing the folder, and now we're going to sleep. The next morning they went to Tiffany and there ordered the apostle according to the design made that night. The statue would be made of silver, be hollow inside and 2 meters high without a pedestal. According to the drawing, the statue had a wonderful model. The apostle's cloak was lavishly pleated and fastened at the back. Raffles informed Tiffany that this closure had to be put in place so that the statue could be filled within with earth from the Mount of Olives. Tiffany was accustomed to receiving all kinds of strange orders, and he promised to produce the apostle for $8,000 within 8 weeks. That same morning, Mr. Green aka Raffles the Waldorf Astoria Hotel and left for Mr. Whitney's estate. An individual followed closely behind, whose affection at first alarmed Raffles, but later also cheered him up again, as he thought he recognized a detective in this matter. Finally he found that he had nothing to fear from this person. It was like this. When the alarming news of Raffles' arrival had come out, the New York police commissioner had thought about what he should do in this matter. Then he had summoned detectives Fred Gordon and Oscar Wagner and consulted with them about the best way to track down Raffles once he had set foot in America. Fred Gordon, in his 50s, had quietly listened to everything his boss told him and he had calmly smoked his nose warmer. When James Pinkerton finally finished his story, Gordon took the pipe out of his mouth, cleared his throat, and then said, "When I read the report, I made a plan for myself. Before coming here, I once went to the offices of Bremer Lloyd and other steam carriers, and there I checked the passenger lists and looked for the description of some person, which matched what we had from John C. Raffles to have. Then I noticed that a passenger, a certain Mr. Green." "And what suspicion do you have against him?" "Not a single one. My detective instinct only told me to keep an eye on that gentleman. I inquired and learned that he has taken up residence at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel and has rented some of the principal rooms there. I went to the hotel, presented myself as an employee of a jeweler's firm, and asked to see Mr. Green. But just as I was about to be admitted to his place, my plan was thwarted by Mr. Whitney." "Mr. Whitney?" Pinkerton asked in utter amazement. "Yes, Mr. Whitney. The billionaire shines with Mr. Green to be on very intimate terms, as I soon saw the two leaving the hotel together and getting into a car." "And did you perhaps think that Mr. Whitney would be on familiar terms with Raffles? Are you mad? I have Mr. Green has been placed under the strictest security for the time being and hope to know tomorrow whether or not I was mistaken." "You were wrong, of course," laughed Pinkerton. "It is possible," said Fred Gordon, in a more or less mortified tone. "No man is infallible." The telephone rang and Pinkerton picked up the receiver. His face showed the greatest surprise at the words he heard, and when the conversation was over he turned to Fred Gordon. "I'm just getting word there, Mr. Gordon, that you were indeed mistaken. My agent in Player Club informs me that in all probability one of the members of the royal household under the pseudonym of Mr. Green resides in New York and accompanied by Mr. Whitney to the Player Club. The stranger is a member of the Windsor Club in London and will be with Mr. Whitney and the ex-president go hunting." The agent further stated that it is advisable to protect this Mr. Green from possible attacks by anarchists or criminals. Fred Gordon crossed his thumbs and grunted. "Well, then I was mistaken. In any case, I was not so far wrong when I followed Mr. Green's suspect something special. The man could be either one of them, a high-ranking aristocrat or a burglar." At this moment there was shouting. Pinkerton turned to Detective Wagner. "Go and see who wishes to speak to me." The detective got up and opened the door. A policeman entered and announced that waiting in the waiting room was a detective of the Paris police, Alfred Tancred, who wished to speak to the chief. "Come in," said Pinkerton, and a few seconds later the Parisian detective entered. From either side the gentlemen looked at each other with inquisitive eyes. The Franzose took a document from his pocket and handed it to Pinkerton. The latter opened the envelope, took out a paper from the Paris detective headquarters, which stated that Detective Tancred had been specially charged with tracing John C. Raffles in New York. Pinkerton read. Then he returned the piece and offered the visitor a seat. "We are right, gathered in conference on the same case," began the chief, "and above all we must know whether Raffles is already here or still on the way here. We must prevent him at all costs from playing with us the same game as with our colleagues from Scotland Yard." "We are dealing with a shrewd person," replied the Parisian detective, "and I hope for you that you will indeed be more successful than Scotland Yard." "I for myself," asserted Fred Gordon, "have the feeling that we shall blame ourselves as immortally as they do. For my first attempt to invent Raffles here has come to nothing. And if a thing goes wrong in the beginning, I know from experience that nothing will come of it at all." "Then don't meddle in this case, Gordon, and devote your energies to that Chicago bank robbery, and I'll dedicate myself with Detective Wagner to the Raffles case." Fred Gordon gave a mocking laugh. That Wagner, that insignificant person, was his boss's protégé. He had not hitherto given the slightest evidence of any dexterity, and every criminal had escaped him. Gordon thought him a great fool, but Pinkerton seemed to think that Wagner was born for great things. Wagner never made any claims, never made up his own mind, and all he talked was the magpie clapping of Pinkerton's words. Gordon got up, took his hat and said, "Good night. All the best with Raffles hunting. I am leaving for Chicago today." "Good trip," Pinkerton called after him. As soon as Fred Gordon had left the room it was as if a heavy weight had been lifted from Wagner's heart. His face began to shine, he rubbed his hands and said, "Well, we'll get that Raffles." "I would think so too," replied Pinkerton. "I myself shall take special charge of his search. You, Wagner, may in the meantime go to the Waldorf Astoria Hotel and work there in the private service of Mr. Greensteps. See that this gentleman's incognito is strictly enforced." Wagner rose and replied, "I will work to your complete satisfaction." He shook hands with his chief, bowed to the strange detective, and left the office. Pinkerton now asked the Frenchman, "Are you following any trail, perhaps?" "Secure. Yesterday, 2 suspicious persons, wearing false beards, arrived on the Cunard line. They are Mr. Oxford and a servant. This Mr. Oxford traveled first class and seems to have a lot of money. He played very high aboard and lost considerable sums as far as I can tell. I watched him closely, and one day succeeded in breaking into his cabin and finding a business card booklet with a golden crown above an L had been applied. This L proved to me that the booklet belonged to Lord Lister, alias John C. Raffles." "List!" cried Pinkerton, "we have him. Lord Lister, aka John C. Raffles, and, have you followed that trail?" "That's why I come to you now," replied the Frenchman. "After landing, unfortunately, I lost track. But I still have his description." "And that reads?" Pinkerton took a sheet of paper and a fountain pen holder, while the detective dictated. "Height 6 to 4 feet, grey moustache, short grey whiskers, steel blue eyes." "That doesn't match the description from London," Pinkerton claimed. "That may be. None of our colleagues has ever seen Raffles so close that the color of his eyes could be clearly determined. So the description from London is worth nothing." "You may be right, Mr. Tancred. And now let us consider how we serve Mr. Invent Oxford." The gentlemen held conference late into the night, and the result was that Pinkerton dispatched 20 of his best detectives early in the morning to go on the Raffles hunt. And each of those detectives carried in his pocket the description as it had given the Parisian detective. Chapter 4. The Theft of the Indian Emeralds. The next morning the New York Herald ran a major sensational report entitled, "A Bet on $2 Million." In a small hotel room of a boarding house, a guest house, Mr. Oxford, the man so peculiarly watched on the boat by Mr. Tancred. A young man was still in the room, apparently performing the duties of a servant. When Mr. Oxford had read the report of the bet, he called the young man to him. "Look, Mr. Marhome, what do you think of that bet? Could that be a trick by Raffles?" Marhome, or the Flea, as he was called among the London detectives, took the paper and read the report. Then he said, "Yes, Inspector Baxter, you're right. The whole thing smacks of Raffles." "Don't say that name so loudly," whispered Baxter, for it was this one who had taken up residence in the hotel under the name of Oxford. "Let us get to work at once, Marhome, to establish the identity of this Mr. Green. Then first let us inquire by telegraph whether anything new is known about Raffles at Scotland Yard." In the meantime he went to the mirror and tried to see if his false beard was still well attached. "You are absolutely unrecognizable, Mr. Baxter," said the Flea, "and I don't think I'm taken for who I am as a red-haired Irishman either." "I myself did not recognize you at the first moment," said Baxter, "when you came to me on the boat. How come you recognized me so soon?" "Very easy. If one is not too big a fool, one recognizes one's boss everywhere." Laughing, both took their hats and coats and left the guest house. When they came out on the street and took a cab to drive to the telegraph office, they did not notice that two men emerged from a portico on the opposite side, who also took a cab and followed them. They were two New York police officers. They had succeeded, on the basis of the description, that Mr. Tancred of Mr. Oxford, to find out his whereabouts. They followed the two Londoners like a hunting dog through a piece of game and came to the telegraph office a few minutes after this. Unnoticed, one of them approached the desk, where Baxter was standing with the Flea and writing the telegram to London. This telegram was of the following content: Mr. Robinson, London, Beach 16. He was the Deputy of Police Inspector Baxter during his absence from London and his private address. Telegraph me by return to New York, Lemke Boarding House, 4 Grand Street, if there is anything new about Raffles. Goodbye. Oxford. The policeman managed with some effort to read the contents of this telegram's large, bold letters made this easy for him, and he read the name Raffles clearly. Hastily he went to his colleague, who was waiting at the door, and told him in a whisper what he had just discovered. "We are not mistaken," he said, "we have the man, it's Raffles, and I'll go straight to the director of the telegraph office and ask for a copy of the telegram. Meanwhile, you wait here to see which way the two men are going, if they are allowed to leave the building in the meantime, and phone it to the headquarters." The man disappeared and hastened to the director of the telegraph office. Baxter had meanwhile delivered his telegram. When he came out of the building to continue following Mr. Green's trail, the Pinkerton detective already had a copy of the telegram in his hand, and a few minutes later also left the building. He went to headquarters to hear more details from his colleague. In his mind he already shared with the other the large sum that had been placed on the arrest of Raffles by the English police and a few private individuals. He thought about what he would do with the money and that owning a poultry farm was his ideal. His colleague behind Mr. Oxford and his handler rushed up and had reached the Waldorf Astoria Hotel with them. This was, the newspapers reported, the whereabouts of Mr. Green, who had placed the bet with Bennett. When Mr. Oxford had made the hotel porter speak with a generous tip, he informed him that Mr. Green had left the hotel 2 hours ago. He didn't know where Mr. Green had passed away. "We are not so curious about our distinguished guests as to ask them about their travel plans." Unsatisfied with the result of his inquiries, Baxter returned with Marhome to the boarding house to await some message from London. Near the house again stood the two detectives in a doorway, and they shortened the time, because one represented to the other the great advantages of a foul stock. They divided the skin of the bear, which had not yet been caught. To get the money together, they had told none of their colleagues where Mr. Oxford, aka Lord Lister, was staying. They wanted to work the terrain all by themselves. In the evening Mr. Oxford received a telegram from London informing him that no word had been received about Raffles there, but that he must doubtless be in New York. Raffles, therefore, sought on all sides. Meanwhile, as Mr. Green was safe and sound in Mr. Whitney's fine mansion. After a few hours he was the declared darling of the ladies. He was particularly liked by Mrs. Hobson, the wealthy old widow of a Chicago wholesaler. This woman, known for her extreme vanity, wore a precious jewel of emeralds that had once belonged to an Indian monarch. They were stones of fabulous size and beauty, and Charlie Brand, seeing that Raffles was engaged in conversation with the lady, at once perceived his master's intentions and understood that his greatest attention was not the false hair or the brushed face, but the precious piece of jewelry from Mrs. Hobson Gold. Raffles had learned that the lady's late husband had owned a large cannery in Chicago. At once Raffles remembered that in the English army several soldiers had died in strange ways at that time. It was later found that they had been poisoned by the use of tainted American preserved meat. Raffles now asked Miss Hobson if her dead husband had not delivered to the English army. With inflated pride, Mrs. Hobson: "Certainly, Mr. Green. My husband received many awards as a supplier to the army at the time and also received a medal." Replied Raffles, and he appraised the emeralds the lady was wearing. Then suddenly he asked, "Have those emeralds you wear there ever been appraised?" Mrs. Hobson puffed up even more and replied, "They are priceless. Mr. Elkins, the jeweler to the Queen of England, valued them at $4 million. A beautiful piece of jewelry," admired Raffles, and calculated to himself how many cans of rotten meat must have been sold to buy such a precious piece. With the gold which these stones represented, one could relieve the anxieties of many widows and orphans. "Oh, so much." Raffles leaned toward Mrs. Hobson. "How is it, madam," he asked, "that you still wear the widow's veil? Are you quite inconsolable?" "Oh, what shall I tell you? My husband made $2 a year. The men, who hitherto pressed for my hand, could not offer it to me." "So," said Raffles, laughing silently at the coquettish 50-year-old. "How much is your annual income, Mr. Green?" asked Mrs. Hobson with a flattering glance. Raffles clutched his monocle and said, "In the last year my income was $14 million. Mrs. Hobson looked at him dumbfounded. She had to gasp for air like a fish on dry land. Only after a few seconds was she able to answer. "Gee, you're not kidding, are you?" "Not at all," lisped Mrs. Hobson. "How so, Mrs. Hobson?" "Oh, a delightful person. I've always longed to get to know someone like that. My fortune is about $80 million and I also have vast possessions. I can't compete with Whitney and Vanderbilt, but if I marry a man of capital, we could outrun Rockefeller. If I can help you with that, Mrs. Hobson, it would be my ideal to help realize your ambitious plans." Again she beckoned coquettishly and whispered, "You can make me happy, Mr. Green." One evening Raffles went for a walk with Charlie Brand on a secluded side path of the great park and told him that he intended to take the precious emeralds of Mrs. Hobson, and to spend the money they were to make for the bequests of those who had died after the use of the tainted flesh. A craziest plan matured in his brain. He hastened to the great veranda of the villa, where the guests were sitting at the tea table. With a bow he approached Mrs. Hobson. "It's such a wonderful evening, Mrs. Hobson. Don't you feel like going for a walk in the park?" "Oh yes," replied the widow, and she was already getting up. Raffles had a plan. When he was with Mrs. Hobson went into the park, he arranged it so that the lady had to go past the undergrowth in which the detective was hiding, who guarded him everywhere. Mrs. Hobson started talking about several female acquaintances, about whom she was able to tell all kinds of scandalous histories. In particular she elaborated on the daughter of the Copper King Blatt, who had run off with her pecker a few weeks ago. No lady was spared. Mrs. Hobson knew something about everyone, and while Mr. Raffles seized the lady by the arm, he cried, apparently quite startled, "Is someone there?" The cracking of branches and twigs ensued, and in the next moment a man appeared and ran away. "Stop or I'll shoot!" cried Raffles, and with well-played terror he pulled out a revolver. Terrified, Mrs. Hobson against Raffles. She stared at the undergrowth with fixed eyes. It receded again, a dark shadow appeared, which like a tiger Mrs. Hobson flew to the throat. She fell unconscious. Raffles meanwhile leaned forward and whispered, "Well done, Charlie. Now go home unnoticed." Now bent over Mrs. Hobson, carefully loosened the emerald necklace and slipped it into his pocket. It was a few moments before Mrs. Hobson, hanging from his neck, came to. "Be calm," he whispered, "the thief has fled." He took her back to the terrace of the villa. Exhausted, she sank there in a chair, exclaiming continually, "A thief, a thief." Raffles told what had happened and how the thief had fled. "Where's your chain?" asked Mrs. Whitney. "My necklace?" With trembling hands Mrs. Hobson to her neck. "The necklace is gone, stolen no doubt," exclaimed Raffles, startled. The thief succeeded, Mrs. Hobson, to snatch the precious piece. With wide-open eyes, Mrs. Hobson everything Raffles told. Mr. Whitney immediately had all his servants searched the whole park. But of the enigmatic unknown there was nothing to discover but an abandoned hat. These the servants found at the exit of the park, and in the hat was written a name: Oscar Wagner. Mr. Whitney took the hat and said, "I will immediately inform the police headquarters tomorrow. That Oscar Wagner must certainly be found," and showed Charlie Brand the necklace he had taken from Mrs. Hobson. He was not at all convinced that anyone should return the necklace to the lady. Chapter 5. The Man Without Hat. The next morning, as the latest sensational news, the newspapers reported the looting of the precious emeralds from Mrs. Hobson. The New York Herald even expressed its opinion that the theft of the precious jewel could be blamed on Raffles, who was, in all probability, located in America. This newspaper article gave a great stir to the New York police, as well as Inspector Baxter, aka Oxford. Baxter immediately believed that it was Raffles who had stolen the jewelry. "Raffles goes to work here too," he said to the Flea. "He's already cut one of his pieces." The Flea thought for a moment and read the article again. He, too, came to the conclusion that it must indeed be Raffles, who with Mrs. Hobson had stolen the precious emeralds. They immediately set out for the villa to see Mr. Whitney and did not notice that they were being followed by the two detectives. At the same time Pinkerton was also with Mr. Tancred made his way to the villa and arrived there 2 hours earlier than Baxter aka Oxford. That same morning, Mr. Whitney went hunting with Mr. Green. Lord Lister had instructed his assistant Charlie Brand to return to New York with the small suitcase and take up residence there at the Clifton Hotel, under the name of Schultz, and await his return. Charlie Brand took the emeralds of Mrs. Hobson with you. When Pinkerton and Detective Tancred arrived at the villa about 11 o'clock, Mr. Whitney and Mr. Green absent. Mrs. Hobson received the two gentlemen and told them how a man from the undergrowth approached her and Mr. Green had jumped in. The latter he had knocked down with a punch. He had nearly strangled her and then robbed the emeralds. Pinkerton bade her show him the undergrowth in order to discover any traces of the fight. She was ready at once, and also told that the assailant had lost his hat during the struggle. "That is very important," claimed Pinkerton. "Where is the hat?" "Den has Mr. Whitney." "Then we will look for him," replied Mrs. Hobson. A servant appeared on her bells and told that Mr. Whitney had gone hunting with several gentlemen early in the morning. "Can you help us too?" asked Pinkerton. "Do you know where the hat is that the thief has lost?" "Mr. Whitney has locked in his safe." "Good Lord. Then he is unreachable for us. Can you also tell us how we can reach Mr. Whitney?" "Impossible. Mr. Whitney is always hunting in remote areas, and none of us know where he is going." "Did Mr. Whitney say when he comes back?" "I can't tell you about that either." "Good," said Pinkerton. Then he turned to Mrs. Hobson. "Would you be so kind as to accompany us to the park?" The lady went out with the two gentlemen and again Mrs. Hobson fierce. The pair then traced the fugitive's tracks, which were clearly visible in the soft bottom. "That is not the mark of a gentleman's boot," said Detective Tancred, pointing to a trail on the ground. "That's a very common American shoe print." Mr. Pinkerton also looked at the track and followed it for a few yards. He too came to the conclusion that an ordinary man had been working here. "The fugitive must, in my view, be a stranger," claimed Tancred. "Why?" "Because the soles of the fugitive are studded, just like the military shoe of a German or English soldier." "But the English soldier's shoe has a very different shape. This one here must be a German who has not been in the country long, for he is still wearing the shoes he had brought with him. Do we want to follow the trail further?" "Secure," replied Pinkerton, "and we want from Mrs. Hobson say goodbye." The gentleman did so and then disappeared into the park. The tracks led in a large circle around a country house to a rocky spot, and only with great difficulty could they recognize further tracks on the hard ground. At last the tracks led back to Mr. Whitney back. Seeing this, the detectives decided to search the villa again. They had been working for nearly 5 hours. At that time Baxter and the flea had also arrived at the villa and had joined Mrs. Hobson present. This lady was very upset and tired by the incident and let Mr. Oxford know that she could no longer receive visitors. The inspector had posed as a reporter to the clerk, but he was unable to interrogate the clerk, who had been ordered not to give anyone any information about Mr. Green. In vain they had to return to New York, and again the detectives followed them without suspecting that their chief himself was present at the villa. Just as they were about to board the train to New York, a hatless man came out of the station and got into the same compartment in which the two detectives had taken their seats. The man was evidently very excited, and the two detectives noticed that he wore a fake beard. The left half of his glued-on beard had come loose and was hanging down. Immediately the detectives suspected that they had a criminal in front of them and started a conversation with him. One of the detectives said, "Tell me, take off your false beard and stick it up a little better." Startled, the addressed looked at the detective. Then he laughed with a broad grin, and he answered, "Don't you know me? Is my disguise with those grey whiskers so good?" Both police officers now laughed heartily. They recognized their colleague Wagner and shook his hand. Wagner was proud not to have been recognized by them. "Where are you from?" they both asked him at the same time. "I was here on a special assignment and now I am going back to New York." "Without a hat?" "Yes. I lost him. But what are you doing here?" The detectives exchanged a look of understanding. Their colleague was not allowed to know that they were hunting Raffles. They had no intention of sharing the reward with Wagner, and besides, this clumsy man could spoil the whole affair. "I have visited a fowl park near here, which I want to buy," said one of the detectives, and then he began to elaborate on the advantages of a fowl park. At the station at New York they left Wagner and again followed Mr. Oxford and his conductor, who returned to their boarding house. Meanwhile Pinkerton and Tancred had searched the villa from top to bottom in vain. At last they heard from a worker that a few hours ago a man without a hat had run at full speed to the station. "That's him!" cried Pinkerton. "All devils, now he has escaped us. But we are on his trail." He quickly went to the station and learned at the ticket counter that a man without a hat had taken a ticket to New York and had left by train. "Can you describe this man to us?" Pinkerton asked, after the gentlemen introduced themselves. "Can remember, slightly graying sideburns." "Then we have him," said Tancred. "That is the description I gave of him, isn't it?" "Certainly." Neither he nor Tancred could have guessed that Wagner had thus disguised himself. They had to wait another half-hour before the train left. Meanwhile the chief telephoned his desk and had the detectives who guarded the station inquire whether they had seen a hatless man with grey whiskers and moustache. They telephoned him with an affirmative answer and added that 2 officers were chasing him. Pinkerton smiled contentedly. "Chances favorable to us, Mr. Tancred," he said to the latter. "2 of my best agents are already following the wanted man. Thanks to your description we recognized the thief. So escape is impossible for him." Completely reassured, he now returned to New York and found Wagner sitting on his desk. He had already removed his false beard and now told his superior that Mr. Whitney and Mr. Green were out hunting, so he had returned to New York, that he had behaved clumsily during the assignment to protect Mr. Green, nor that that was why he had fled to New York. He had heard nothing of the emerald theft. When Pinkerton spoke to him of this matter, Wagner at first made a very stunned look. However, in order not to show his ignorance, he pretended to be perfectly informed and confirmed all that Mrs. Hobson of the attack. When he was alone, he broke into a sweat of fear. Only now did he realize that he had made himself appear as an assailant. Time that Mr. Whitney handed the lost hat to Mr. Pinkerton, everyone would mistake it for a thief. His knees buckled as he thought of the predicament he'd put himself in, and he came to believe that it was best for him to leave America as soon as possible. If it weren't for that hat, in which his name was written, he wouldn't be so bad. Now, however, he would be condemned by every judge. He cursed his decision to become a detective and to leave his country. Pinkerton came to him again and asked, "Didn't you see a man with grey sideburns at Mr. Whitney's villa?" "No," lied Wagner, "I have not seen such a person." "That doesn't matter either. We are already on his trail." Wagner thought to himself who could be the other with whiskers, and he came to the conclusion that he must have a doppelganger. Chapter 6. The Flight. 3 months had passed when Raffles met Mr. Whitney returned from the hunt in New York. He immediately went to see his friend Charlie Brand and was greatly surprised at his sickly appearance. "The New York air doesn't seem to suit you too well, my boy." "I agree," replied Charlie Brand, "and I'm glad you're back with me. I have been very nervous and actually did not dare to leave this house." "Have you not been out all this time?" "No." "You are a great fool. Don't you understand that you attract attention by staying home all the time? I have just come from Tiffany and can inform you that we are leaving New York early tomorrow by steamer and going to Naples. The Silver Apostle, whom I had made for the Pope, is being taken to our steamer today. That will be an interesting job, dear fellow." "I don't understand what you have in mind," replied Charlie Brand. "How do you come to give the Pope a Silver Apostle as a present?" Raffles laughed and lit a cigarette. Then he said, "Has something special happened? I haven't read a newspaper in a week. Do the magazines still write about me? I cut out all the articles. They talk about you every morning, afternoon and evening." Raffles laughed again and said, "The newspaper articles about me will eventually form a large library, and if I sit in the corner of the hearth as an old man and read all that, I will enjoy them in my old age. In fact, the newspapers had to pay me a large fee, as I supply the best copy for them. Has the contest I'm holding already been resolved?" "Not until this afternoon," replied Charlie Brand, "and the papers say the best detectives in America are looking for you, that Baxter and his men have also come from London and that a detective from Paris has stepped ashore here. Then only someone from Berlin is missing. Maybe I'll play for that myself. But get ready now and I can show you some things about New York." The gentleman left the boarding house after Raffles paid the bill. "We'll sleep in a hotel in Hoboken tonight, so we'll be close to our boat." Charlie Brand provided a cab, which they drove to a large restaurant. The friends gave their luggage to the porter and went to dinner. Then, as they strolled through the streets of New York to buy some entrance tickets to the theater where they wanted to go in the evening, Raffles suddenly grabbed Charlie Brand by the arm and took him into a nearby shop. It was a women's hat shop. Charlie Brand didn't understand what Raffles had for sale here. A shop assistant showed him the latest models and after searching for half an hour, he said there was no choice for him. In the street he called another cab. "What did you really want in that shop?" "To protect us both from Police Inspector Baxter. He was standing near us, and next to him stood the only Scotland Yard detective who means anything, namely Mahome or the Flea. Luckily they both looked the other way. Do you see that it was good of me that I stayed at home all those weeks?" "Nonsense. That was just a coincidence, son." As Pinkerton learned that Mr. Whitney had returned from the hunt, he notified Tancred and Wagner. The two of them would go with him to the villa, so that, using the thief's hat as a clue, they might further investigate the man who bought the emeralds of Mrs. Hobson had stolen. The Parisian detective at once declared himself ready, while Wagner suddenly feigned a headache and called in so ill that he had to go to the doctor and was unable to accompany his superior. He took a deep breath as the chief traveled to the villa with Tancred alone, checked the list of the departing boats. He resolved to leave New York without delay, and as a boat was leaving for Naples the next morning, he went to the transit office and took a second-class ticket to Naples. Then he went to a small hotel in Hoboken and rented a room there for the night. He had not the slightest suspicion that John Raffles and Charlie Brand were staying in the adjoining room. Pinkerton had as Mr. Whitney received the hat and was surprised to find the name of his protégé Oscar Wagner written in it. The matter seemed strange and puzzling to him. He thought for several minutes. Then he said to the Parisian detective, "Come on, we don't have a minute to lose. We have followed a false trail, the trail of my own detective. He will be able to clarify. In any case, he was not the thief of Mrs. Hobson's emeralds. That could only have been this lady's guide. And who was that conductor?" He looked at the Parisian detective and grabbed him by the arm in the greatest excitement. "Mr. Green from Scotland," Pinkerton answered himself, "that enigmatic Mr. Green. And who is Mr. Green, this man of great manners, this person who intruded on Mr. Whitney as Duke of Rochester? It is Raffles. I'll hang myself if it's not Raffles. Oh, I can be furious when I think how I've been tricked. But you are largely to blame for that." The Parisian detective shrugged. "You charge me there very unjustly, and what you suppose there is very daring. I maintain that you are mistaken, and that Raffles is indeed the man with the grey whiskers, whom you are having your detectives check. I'll prove you wrong at my desk. Go with me to New York at once." Pinkerton was nervous and restless. He hastened back to New York as soon as possible, and sent an urgent telegram to the Marshal in London to inquire where the Duke of Rochester was at this moment. At the same time he telegraphed for the Duke's description, as the New York police were likely to have been horribly tricked by a swindler who impersonated the Duke of Rochester. Then he ordered that both agents Harrison and Smith be located, lest Mr. Oxford could be arrested at once. Then he had Wagner inquired, and then he heard that this detective had packed his things and left his room. The chief was stunned. He couldn't understand why Wagner had run off so suddenly. Harrison and Smith, meanwhile, were nowhere to be found, but the next morning at 10 o'clock the much-desired answer came by cable telegram. It read, "Police Chief, New York. Duke of Rochester resides in London. Just spoke to him on the phone. Description of the Duke: height 1.74 meters, figure, somewhat obese, face, blushing, hair, blonde, age, 45 years. Special badge, limps on the left leg." With a triumphant smile, Pinkerton handed this telegram to Mr. Tancred. And he asked in a long voice, "Now, Dash?" "You are right," replied the Parisian detective. "The description of Mr. Green and of the Duke of Rochester is very inconsistent. It's Raffles, Raffles it is. The infamous Lord Lister. Damned. The fellow slips through his fingers like an eel. That will be a black page in my career." At 11 o'clock in the evening Raffles and Charlie Brand left the Lyceum Theatre. Before they got into a cab, they heard the boys shout, "Raffles caught! Raffles, the thief of the Indian emeralds!" Lord Lister paused for a moment, then stuck his monocle in his eye and calmly bought a newspaper. Charlie Brand was shaking on his legs. The pair now sat in the carriage and Raffles ordered to ride to the boats at 23rd Street in Hoboken. "You should always have a bottle of brandy with you, Charlie," said Raffles. "You tremble like a damsel's dog and you're as scared as a teenage girl." "I wish we had never seen America," replied Charlie. Raffles laughed. "I really like this country. The press keeps you so well informed about everything. It is much easier to work here than in Europe. But listen now, the coffin to the Pope is loaded on the steamer. It reads as sender, Mr. Harry Smith from Chicago. You are that Mr. Smith. You must also put that name in the passenger list. You absolutely don't know me. Tell the waiter to wake you tomorrow at 8 o'clock. The boat leaves at 9 o'clock. And hang in there, Charlie. See you next time." He shook hands with Charlie, and disappeared into the darkness of 23rd Street. Chapter 7. A match for Raffles. The next morning Baxter begged the head office and asked to speak to the chief. "If you want to speak to the chief," was the reply, "you must go straight to Hoboken to the steam line to Italy. Raffles is arrested there." "What?" Baxter called back, "are you not mistaken?" "No. We received word this morning that Raffles was recognized by one of the officers of the steamship company when he bought a passage ticket." Baxter hung up the receiver again. "Come on," he said to Mahone, "we have not a second to lose. We must go to Hoboken to arrest Raffles." Mahone smiled briefly, but very ironically. He didn't believe much of that arrest. But he nevertheless followed his chief, took his place in the car and drove to Hoboken. At the same moment 2 policemen also went to a car to drive to Hoboken as well. But there already a colleague came to meet them, who exclaimed, "Mr. Harrison, Mr. Smith, I've been looking for you since yesterday afternoon by order of the chef. You must immediately arrest Mr. Oxford, the man with the grey whiskers, and his handler." "Excellent," said Mr. Harrison, "don't hold us up." He hastily jumped into the car with his colleague and encouraged the driver to overtake the other car. The driver drove at the fastest pace, but he still arrived an instant too late to the boat, which was just beginning to move. Several precious minutes passed. They had to wait 10 minutes before the next boat could follow the alleged refugees Baxter and Mahone to Hoboken. Coincidentally, a harbor steamer passed the pier. Mr. Harrison called the captain and identified himself, whereupon the latter agreed to take the 2 aboard and steam after the ferry boat. Through the captain's binoculars, Mr. Harrison clearly continued to stand on the bowsprit. Half an hour later, the 2 officers arrived at the pier. Quickly they jumped ashore and saw the pursued hasten to the boat, which was to depart at 9 o'clock. The last signal sounded and Baxter made his leg. But the two officers rushed too, and two men, Pinkerton and Tancred, were walking in front of Baxter, who also had to join the boat. Wagner ran before these two as fast as his legs could carry him. Pinkerton recognized his detective and exclaimed, "Stand still, Mr. Wagner." But these words doubled Wagner's haste to reach the ready boat. He was of the firm opinion that his superior was coming to arrest him. Neither Pinkerton and Tancred were runners, and so it was that first Baxter and Mahone, and then Harrison and Smith, came before them. "There's the man with the grey sideburns," exclaimed Tancred, and flew away. Wagner was just standing on the loading platform when he heard behind him, "Stop or I'll shoot." Around with trembling knees. Behind him stood two men, and in the next instant he recognized two of his colleagues, who threw themselves at the stranger at great speed, grabbed them, and pulled ashore again. Wagner, on the other hand, was pulled onto deck by a sailor, who at the same time removed the gangway. Now also the mighty propellers began to work and brought the boat off the land. The ship's chapel began to play "Honey, Ade. Divorce is bad." Those left behind waved handkerchiefs and hats, threw up kisses, and dried tears. And no one paid attention to the wrestling match between Baxter, the policeman, Pinkerton, and Tancred. "Here's Raffles," Harrison called to his chief. "Idiot," roared Baxter, punching the man. "You are mad," cried Pinkerton to his men. "There stands Raffles on board. Let go of that man." "Who are you?" asked Tancred now of Baxter. "Police Inspector Baxter of Scotland Yard of London." "And what kind of camel are you?" "Commissioner Tancred from Paris." The detectives looked at each other in complete astonishment for a few moments, until each erupted into a flood of invective. And in between there was suddenly a hearty laughter. That was Detective Mahone. He had sat down on a barrel and laughed until he couldn't take it anymore and kicked his feet against the empty barrel. On the parapet of this boat, however, there were three people. Number one was Charlie Brand, or, as he had registered, Mr. Harry Smith of Chicago. He was pale with nervousness, and a naval officer next to him said, "Well, seasickness makes itself felt soon. Come and let us have a good glass of whiskey." And another stood there, in dire need of a glass of whiskey, and that was the escaped Detective Wagner. Number 3, however, was John Raffles. He leaned against the parapet and looked through the binoculars at the struggle between the detectives. He immediately understood the context of the whole story, and a smile played on his lips. He walked up and down the deck a bit and lit his umpteenth cigarette. On the passenger list he was registered as Senor Beck from Cuba. Raffles had disguised himself excellently with a brown beard, so that even Charlie Brand did not recognize him. It was not until the fourth day of the voyage that he entered into a conversation with him, in the presence of a naval officer, about the weather. No one could even suspect that these two belonged together. Raffles was soon on very good terms with this officer, who showed him the whole ship, so that Raffles soon knew the way and also saw the storeroom where the chest with the silver apostle, which was intended for the Pope, stood. When the officer closed off the room, Raffles said to himself, "A very simple lock that is very easy to open." After a journey of 12 days the lights of the lighthouse of Genoa finally appeared. The passengers had gathered their luggage and waited impatiently for the steamer to dock. It slowly steamed into the harbor. A police boat approached the last pier, clambered aboard, and the captain informed the captain that the much-wanted Raffles was on the ship for a few seconds. Then he said, "I have a passenger in second class on board, who seems a bit suspicious to me. He has cabin number 48. The steamer still had half an hour to steam, and the detectives, meanwhile, had plenty of time to investigate. When Mr. Wagner saw the detectives enter his cabin, he broke into a sweat. "Can you identify yourself?" the Italian asked. "No," replied Wagner, in a trembling voice, "but I know what you come for. I swear to you, however, that I did not steal the jewel." "What jewel?" the other asked. Wagner told a long story. That he would take him into temporary custody until the necessary clarification came from America. However, the Italian also immediately saw that Wagner was not the much sought-after Raffles. There the first officer approached him with a business card in hand. "Look here, Commissioner," he said. "You are right. A flight attendant just brought me this package. We have John Raffles on board. He sent this to us as a memorial. His beard and his card. Read it." The policeman read. "The clever Americans, English, French and Italian police officers, Special Inspector Baxter, his loyal colleagues from New York, and the Parisian Commissioner Tancred, I send my best thanks for the funny scene that happened on my departure from New York. Furthermore, I salute the Italian detectives, and I regret that I cannot see their facial expressions when they read this card. John C. Raffles aka Lord Lister." The Italian cast a formidable curse and then ran to the landing area, where all the passengers had to pass. Raffles couldn't escape here. Slowly the passengers now walked down the gangway, closely watched by the detectives. Now the last one had already passed, but Raffles hadn't passed. "Pick up the landing bridge," ordered the captain. "The ship will be searched until we have it." The sailors and stewards prepared for the yacht. No spot was left unexplored. But there was nothing to discover of Raffles. All that was left of him was the black beard. And that was sadly little. "The fellow has jumped overboard," said the captain, and with this message the Italian detectives were able to disembark. And this message was also telegraphed to Pinkerton and to Baxter. The passengers, meanwhile, had been waiting impatiently for their luggage in the customs building. Finally it came aboard. "To His Holiness Pope Pius X, read," one of the two officers on the metal shield fastened to a large chest in which the Tiffany firm had packed the present for the Pope. The officer looked at the accompanying paper and read, "Mr. Harry Smith." This one emerged from the crowd. "The box is free of import duties," said the officer. "You can take that baggage with you." Mr. Harry Smith called some servants, had the box loaded, and drove it to the station. Before boarding the train for Rome, he delivered a telegram to the Vatican announcing the arrival of the gift. When he arrived at the central station in Rome towards morning, he was received by an elderly cleric. After the gentleman had exchanged the necessary courtesies, the coffin with the silver apostle was brought into the Lateran, there provisionally unpacked and set up before the high altar. Here the gift had to be consecrated before the Pope accepted it and decided what to do with it. Mr. Harry Smith, meanwhile, had alighted at Hotel Continental, as Raffles had arranged with him. Chapter 8. The Priest's Dream. Not far from the high altar sat in a church chair a young priest who had the night watch in the chapel. His job was to warn the Swiss soldiers, who were lined up behind the wide curtains, at the slightest suspicious sound, and to check with them whether an intruder had crept into the chapel. International thieves had already tried several times to rob the valuables present in the chapel, which were decorated with beautiful precious stones. The young priest read in a Latin prayer book and murmured half aloud to himself. Suddenly he heard a sound, as if a metal had been slammed together. In the bright moonlight that fell through the high arched windows he could clearly see everything that happened. The sound was repeated, and the young priest noticed that it came from the silver apostle. He even now, if only for a moment, saw a head looking away from the silver apostle. The young priest rose and, not being afraid, went to the statue and looked to see if perhaps a stranger had hidden behind it. But he found nothing, and thinking that his imagination had played tricks on him, he returned to his seat and began to read again by the dim light of a lamp. The night hours passed slowly. The sweet scent of incense weighed heavily on the temples of the youthful watchman, who had the greatest difficulty in staying awake. He put the breviary aside, stretched out his arms once, and looked through the chapel with a sleepy face. And suddenly he dreamed, he thought, a terrible dream. He saw the silver apostle's robes open and a black figure emerge from it. The priest looked paralyzed at this apparition. And the strange figure turned to him and drew nearer and nearer with slow strides. The young priest wanted to call for help, but his voice caught in his throat. He let the figure come toward him and did not resist, when it tied a cloth over his face soaked in a liquid that smelled of almonds. Only a few seconds passed, then the young priest fell unconscious in his prayer chair. The strange priest looked at him for a few moments, and then said to himself, "The 24 hours in the silver apostle were dreadful, but I've almost won my bet now, for now I shall for a time appropriate the Pope's Murillo." It was Raffles who had been hidden in the silver apostle. 10 hours before the steamer landed, she had crept into the hold, opened the lock, and, with Charlie Brown's help, crawled into the silver statue. In this way Raffles had suddenly disappeared aboard the steamer, and neither the detectives nor the naval officers had been able to find him. Now he stood in the chapel and looked around. He soon discovered the wanted Murillo on the left wall. He took a ladder from one side of his being, climbed it up dead silent, took a sharp knife from his pocket and carefully cut the painting from the frame along the extreme edges. The work had gone on for nearly an hour, when he finally carried the painting rolled up in his hand and put the ladder back in its place. The church towers of Rome struck 4 o'clock when Raffles heard the locks of the church doors creaking, signifying that they were being opened from the outside. He squatted in a niche and, hidden behind a pillar, he waited until the double doors opened and the young priest came to relieve his comrade. When he finally came and discovered the sleeping man, he stroked him and woke him. Sleepy, the other opened his eyes, muttered some unintelligible words, and got up. He did not even hear the other say, "I will report to the cardinal what has happened." With unsteady steps, still under the influence of the anesthetic, the young priest went to the exit of the chapel. When he came to the gate, the Swiss soldiers shouted a loud halt. Astonished, the priest stopped and asked, What do you want from me?" The officer on duty came to him and said, "Who are you?" "I have been on watch," replied the young priest. "That can't be all right. The priest who was on watch left the chapel for you a moment." That's impossible. I was alone in the chapel." "No," said the officer, "we have our eyes to see and not to sleep. Just before you a priest left the chapel, going to the Vatican." At the same moment there was a loud call to watch from the chapel. The soldiers rushed in hastily. In the middle of the chapel stood the priest who had the morning service, and with outstretched arm he pointed to the empty frame of the painting on the wall. "What is it?" the officer asked. "There, the Murillo has been stolen." For a moment there was the deepest silence. The men felt as if they saw a ghost. They went to the empty frame to convince themselves once more, and could discover nothing but the empty wall. The Murillo was gone. The priest turned to the officer. "Go quickly to Cardinal Mancini and tell him what happened. Alert the whole guard and the papal police. Everything must be done to get the Murillo back." The officer flew off to carry out the order. The priest now turned to his ministerial brother, who stood numbly against a pillar. "Unfortunately, your dereliction of duty has done us great harm." I don't know how it happened," stammered the priest. "I must have been sedated." He now remembered the dream and told it as best he could. Cardinal Mancini, who had come in the meantime, also repeated the dream. The cardinal went to and examined the silver apostle, and then discovered the secret entrance through which a man could easily enter the figure. At the same time he found a letter addressed to the Pope's secretariat. The cardinal opened it and read, "I hereby inform you are well born that I am unfortunately obliged to borrow your Murillo for a few weeks. You can be unconcerned, as the Murillo, when she's done her duty, will be returned undamaged to its old place. My name will guarantee that. John C. Raffles." The cardinal read the letter twice, then held it near him. Without giving any explanation to the bystanders, he said, "The matter has been clarified. I have complete confidence in the contents of this letter. You all must remain silent about what has happened here and answer the questions of those curious about the Murillo's residence, that it is being restored. Cover the empty space until the painting is in our possession again. Hang a velvet curtain in front of it." With a wave of his hand the cardinal left the chapel, and none of those who remained dared to transgress the cleric's command. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning when Mr. Harry Smith and a priest left the Continental Hotel in a car with the priest, to take, as they claimed, a tour of the environs of Rome. But in vain the porter waited in the evening for the guest's return, and when he had not returned the next day either, Mr. Harry Smith rented out again. Mr. Harry Smith had become Charlie Brand again, and the priest had turned into John C. Raffles. They had taken the car to the station and taken tickets to Brindisi. In Brindisi they took advantage of their time to change the appearance by donning false beards. So the next day they boarded a steamer bound for New York as his valet on the passenger list. In an ordinary roll of paper lay the stolen Murillo in Raffles' cabin. On the 22nd of January the steamer entered New York. They took up residence in a small 54th Street boarding house. In Player Club that evening, as usual, the members sat together, and the subject of discussion was, as usual, Raffles pranks. Mr. Bennet had to take quite a few bites, and he was glad that he hadn't experienced the disadvantages of Raffles personally. Mr. Bennet had just stated for the 12th time that he would have recognized John Raffles in Mr. Whitney's place at once, when the footman of the club, accompanied by a stranger wearing a scroll, approached Mr. Bennet. "This gentleman wishes to see you," said the footman. Mr. Bennet could not remember ever seeing the stranger, and asked in a high voice what was required of him. The stranger jerked off his false beard, stuck his monocle in his eye with a smile, and Mr. Bennet looked into the clean-shaven, witty face of John C. Raffles. Deep silence reigned among those present. Raffles had only to shout, "Hands up," and without any resistance, all the wallets, checkbooks, diamonds, and watches would be given to him. "Gentlemen," said Raffles, making a courteous bow, "I come in response to my bet with Mr. Bennet, and will furnish him with proof that I have accepted the bet." Smiling, he untied the scroll, which he carried in his left hand, and then spread the Murillo on the carpet in front of the heart. A loud cry of admiration went up. "Can you prove the authenticity?" asked Mr. Bennet. Without saying a word, Raffles turned the painting over, and now everyone could recognize the papal coat of arms on the back. The club members stared in silence. "How did you get this painting?" asked Mr. Bennet. Raffles made a comical move when he introduced himself. "John C. Raffles." Then he spoke. "You see, Mr. Bennet, that I do indeed have a precious Murillo, and that I have won my bet, which caused such a stir here in the club, gloriously. Are you surprised about it? But you mustn't do that, Mr. Bennet, you mustn't do that at all. You may take some advantage of what has happened, and if I may give you some good advice for such a brief acquaintance, I should like to say, be a little more careful with your bets in the future, Mr. Bennet. And now I very politely request the check to which I am entitled." The club members burst out laughing. And Mr. Bennet? He was wise enough to laugh with, although that laugh sounded a little forced. Then he said, "You are right. I lost my bet." He took his checkbook out of his pocket, sat down at one of the writing tables and filled in one of the sheets, which he then tore from the booklet and handed over to the winner. "Here's the check." Raffles took the paper, looked at it closely, and said, "I'll send you this picture tomorrow, as soon as the check is cashed by me. You, in turn, can have her packed with the utmost care and sent back to Rome, preferably under excellent and trusted escort. If you do this, Mr. Bennet, you will commit the Vatican to you forever, I can assure you. Then I wanted to say this. I especially hope that you will in no way make it difficult for me to collect this check, and that, if you may have planned to do so, you will not inform the detectives of my absence before noon tomorrow afternoon. You will certainly be willing to comply with this fair request on my part, for otherwise you would indeed be acting against the habits of a gentleman, and, Mr. Bennet, I assure you I should avenge myself splendidly." After these words, which were uttered in a pleasant, deep, and rich voice, he calmly rolled up the picture again, put the check just received in his breast pocket, and departed, having made an impeccable bow to the gentleman present. But then one of the club members got in his way and held out a voluminous book bound in morocco leather, in which all the guests of the club used to write their names. And with a courteous gesture he asked the visitor, "Would you be so kind as to enrich our register with your signature, as you once did at Windsor Club in London?" Raffles looked up in surprise. "You do us a great pleasure indeed," added the club member. "I speak on behalf of all present." Now Raffles took out a fountain pen holder from his inside pocket and wrote his name in the book in large, strong, solid letters. Raffles bowed, the club members bowed, then the stranger disappeared. To the gentleman left behind, the whole story seemed like a mad dream, an apparition from above earthly regions. And had it not been in the voluminous register the striking signature of John C. Raffles, had it not been for Mr. Bennet's delight to have become 2 million poorer, the gentleman would certainly have taken everything that had transpired in the last half hour as a ghost. And Raffles? The next day he cashed the check, the payment of which he did not experience the slightest difficulty. Then he sent the precious Murillo from the Vatican to Mr. Bennet, who, as arranged the night before, took care of the onward dispatch to Rome. And at 2 o'clock in the afternoon the extra circulation afternoon papers carried the latest sensational report on Raffles. The public eagerly bought the papers. The newsboys didn't have hands enough to serve their customers, and the history of the bet and of the unheard of brutal painting theft was devoured by the sensationalist public. About the same time had arrived in London Police Inspector Baxter of Scotland Yard, accompanied by New York Chief Pinkerton. A bomb detonated at their feet could not have had a more terrifying effect on the two policemen than the startling news that Raffles, the great unknown, who they believed had jumped overboard and drowned, was well and truly in New York, and had won his $2 million bet from Mr. Bennett. The next part will contain At the Parisian Apaches. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hope you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.